Hey friends, it's Lily and welcome or welcome back to my channel, and welcome to today's video in which I'm going to be talking about Why I Love Mockingjay by Suzanne Collins. So just a few things before we get into the video. I just want to quickly disclaim. First of all, this video is not meant to try and change anyone's mind or try and attack anyone who doesn't like this book. I am not trying to do that. I am purely just trying to explain with this video the merits that I find in Mockingjay and why I like the book so much. There are definitely flaws with this book that I can fully recognize. Now, in order to kind of make these points, I will sometimes use kind of arguments that are made against the book, but I'm not trying to, use those to kind of argue with those points. I'm more just trying to use those as jumping off points to talk about why those things maybe don't bother me or why I don't view those things negatively. Now, obviously, I'm very, very biased. If you have not watched a video from me before, hello. This is my favorite series of all time. I have read it many, many times and it got me through a lot in my teenage years, so this isn't meant to be an impartial video at all, because I am clearly very attached to the series and can't look at this series in an impartial way. So before anyone comes at me in the comments like this video is not impartial, I know. Lastly, just to say, because people might be like, but I thought Catching Fire was your favourite. And it is. Catching Fire is my favourite in the series, but I think it's pretty well loved. I don't feel like I need to explain why I love Catching Fire so much. It's pretty uniformly most people's favourite book in the series. It's definitely uniformly most people's favourite film in the series. I don't feel the need to talk about why I like it so much because I don't feel like I could add anything to that conversation. By the way, before I get into this video, spoilers for Mockingjay, obviously. So let's get into it. So the first thing I think we need to talk about when we are talking about Mockingjay is the fact that this book is a war book. I would argue that also the first two books in the series are war books. I read an interview with Suzanne Collins recently where she talked about how these stories are all war stories to her. I would argue in the first two books the kind of war stuff is definitely kind of dressed up and definitely sits in the backseat a little bit. I do think the games are a really interesting microcosm of war, and when Katniss comes out of the first games, she is coming back from war. She is kind of a war veteran. She's experiencing PTSD from violence. But obviously in the first two books with the games, the kind of microcosm of war is very dressed up and it's got a lot of pageantry and there's a lot of exciting and adventure stuff. In those two books, we are all entertained by the first two books. They're exciting, they're thrilling, they have plot twists, and you never know what's going to happen next. Mockingjay isn't like that. She takes a lot of those exciting adventure aspects out of this book and, writes a book that is about the cold, horrible realities of war, and it's a very uncomfortable reading experience. And I completely understand if people who enjoyed the first two books enjoyed those primarily for the adventure thrilling type aspects and then get to this book and don't like it because it is so different tonally to the other two books. I also understand that people read a lot for escapism and want to just escape in their stories and don't necessarily want something as dark and heavy as this. I personally don't primarily read for escapism. I primarily read, I think, to just understand the world and to engage with the world and to learn more about people who are different to me and to understand my emotions. I know that's all very wanky, but I'm a Ravenclaw, so that's just the way I am. I definitely do read to escape sometimes and read for escapism, but I personally wouldn't go into a dystopian book for that. So dystopia as a genre has obviously been around for a really long time, and I think there are a few different subgenres of dystopian, but I think there are two that are relevant to the Hunger Games. So we obviously have classic dystopia, the 1984s, The Handmaid's Tale, Brave New World, Never Let Me Go, those types of books which are written with an intention. They are written with a political agenda in mind. They are written to say something about our current society through the lens of a futuristic society that is different to our own in some way. And I would argue that The Hunger Games does fall into this kind of facet of dystopia. I think Suzanne Collins, has something to say. This is written primarily as political commentary, and a lot of it is wrapped up definitely in the first two books in the thrilling adventure type story, but definitely comes to the forefront in this. What I think is interesting about the Hunger Games series in general is that I think it falls into the kind of political commentary type dystopia. But a lot of the books that came off of the success of the Hunger Games, particularly in YA, were more what I would call kind of adventure type dystopia, in that they are still set in a futuristic world. There is a tyrannical government they have to overcome, but I would say the focus of those stories is more so on the adventure thrilling aspect of the book and the interpersonal stories and relationships between the characters rather than the political commentary. And I do think that that adventure type kind of dystopia is definitely present in the first two books in this trilogy. I definitely think it's present, but I think the political commentary is there in the background and it is constantly kind of chugging away in the background. And then I think in this book it kind of really comes to the forefront. This is the book that really pulls the commentary forward and actually kind of makes the adventure thrilling type parts of the book take a step back. This book is still kind of a thriller, it has plot twists. Definitely Suzanne Collins isn't short of plot twists in this book, but I would say that kind of stuff becomes secondary in this book to the political commentary that she is trying to get across. And I think the political commentary that Suzanne Collins is trying to get across in here, from what I've read in interviews and what I can gather, is her discussion of the just war theory. And I'm not going to pretend pretend that I know much about this theory. I'm not a philosopher. From my understanding of like little bits I've read, it is the discussion of like how justifiable is a war in terms of like the cost of human life and the cost of resources and everything. And what's interesting about the Hunger Games series is that she is exploring in this series a justifiable war. You can justify the war that happens in Mockingjay because the people who are rising up have been oppressed for so many years and have been exploited for so many years, and you know, their children have been forced to compete in these games and they've been forced to watch them, and it's been horrific. So it is definitely, I think, by most people's moral codes, you know, a justifiable war. But the point Suzanne Collins is trying to make is that even these justifiable wars have a huge humanitarian cost. Innocent people will die in the crossfire, and children may be bombed in order to further the progress of the rebel side through strategy. And even the people who do survive the war are going to live with PTSD probably for the rest of their life, and they may even pass that PTSD on, and there may be issues with generational trauma for years to come. And what's so interesting about Mockingjay is that she makes this also personal. You know, Gale designs a bomb that kills his best friend's sister. Katniss watches her sister, who she spent the entire trilogy trying to protect, burn right before her eyes. Peter, who has never wanted anything more than to just remain himself, is turned into a weapon by the Capitol in order to kill the person who he loves the most. She makes these topics personal to the characters, and I just find that really interesting, remarkable, particularly for a YA book. And I think, you know, this book isn't meant to be enjoyable. I don't think you are meant to like reading this book. I don't think you are meant to enjoy reading this book, which I don't mind, and I don't mind if I'm reading a book for political commentary, but I completely understand if you are reading books primarily to escape and primarily to enjoy them, I can totally understand how this book doesn't work for you. But I like depressing books, we all know that, so that is partially why I love this book, because I just find all of the discussions in here so fascinating. So now I'm going to move on to a couple of different topics, like out of the kind of broader themes of it being a story about war and everything. There's a few critiques. I can't get to everything because I know there's been various discussions about this book over the years, but I'm just going to discuss ones that I've seen people discussing recently and I've talked about recently with some people. So the first one I wasn't even going to address because I honestly thought this argument had kind of died out, but I saw someone say this on Twitter yesterday, and so I just had to put this in here. And that is that Katniss is very whiny in Mockingjay, and she definitely is suffering. When the book opens, she is suffering with a concussion, she is mentally disorientated, she is seeing visions from her medication in the hospital. And you know, I think the way you view Katniss in this book probably depends on how you viewed her over the previous books. I know there was a very common interpretation of Katniss to be very cold and calculated and, you know, like kind of a badass. I have never interpreted her that way because I think she can be those things in certain moments, but I think what's so remarkable about Katniss as a character is she can be those things, but she is also a very warm character at times, particularly to the people she loves. She really cares about the people that she loves and is very empathetic, and we see that with like her prep team from the Capitol and everything, and she, you know, does have a lot of humanity within her, which is what drew me to her so much when I initially read about her. She isn't perfect, she's not a superhero, she is a teenage girl and she is vulnerable at times, and I think her vulnerability definitely gets lost in the films, and so I think people can sometimes forget that about her character, but I think it's really clear in the books that she is very vulnerable at times. She cries a lot more in the books than she does in the films, and that's okay because she is going through a lot, and I think it's, you know, really justified. I think a lot of this argument of Katniss being whiny in Mockingjay is the same argument that is made for Harry in Order of the Phoenix, and I don't buy into it there either. I think both of those characters have been through so much stuff. I mean, just for Katniss, you know, just to list off everything she's been through up until the beginning of Mockingjay, her father died when she was 11 years old, which in itself is a very traumatic event. We don't give enough weight to characters losing their parents in YA books. And not only did she lose her father at that point, but she also basically lost her mother to a deep depression. She had to become the head of the household when she was 11 years old, and then she got put into Hunger Games. Everyone she kind of trusts and, you know, the authority figures in her life have lied to her at this point. The president, who is all-powerful, has threatened her and her family's lives, and the person that, you know, she seeks a lot of comfort from, who I would argue by this point in the series she loves, is being tortured in the Capitol to torment her. That's a lot. I don't know, I feel like she has the warrant to be a little bit whiny, but I do understand how it can be very frustrating to read about. But I love that Suzanne Collins, you know, portrays Katniss's PTSD in a way that feels realistic to me and that feels accurate. I just can't believe that someone would go through all of that and not feel the effects of that. To be honest, I think the fact that Katniss does what she does in this book is remarkable, and that she is not just, you know, sitting in therapy or sitting in her hospital bed the entire time. But I do understand how it can be frustrating for people to read about, especially when she's being knocked out a lot of the time. But I don't really like take her being knocked out all the time as like a frustrating thing out of narrative. I do understand how people take that, but I just grow frustrated with it in narrative because it's clear the rebels just don't care about her mental well-being and are just using her because she is, you know, helpful to the war effort, but they don't actually care about her mental well-being. So as soon as as she starts to have a breakdown, she starts to, you know, show signs of trauma and PTSD, they're just like, let's knock her out and just get rid of this problem. I find that very frustrating, but I do think, again, it's realistic, and I think it's a really interesting way that Suzanne Collins portrays the rebel side as not the inherently amazing good guys. What I love about the book is the nuance and how she doesn't portray the rebels to be these completely amazing good guys. There is nuance to them. They don't do things necessarily the way they should be. They don't treat, you know, the people who are helping their cause in the way they should be. They don't give Katniss the emotional support they probably should, and they are willing to sacrifice some civilian lives in order to further their cause. And, you know, you can agree with them or disagree with them. I think Suzanne Collins lets you kind of interpret that as you want. I think she has her opinion. I think she still leaves room to kind of disagree with her if you want to as well. Okay, you know what? We need to talk about Finnick. So before I get into this, I feel like I'm gonna get so much hate for this. So Finnick isn't my favourite character in the trilogy. I would say he's number 6. I think it goes Katniss, Peter, Haymitch, Joanna. Those are all locked and loaded, ready to go. And then probably Boggs and then Finnick, I think. I've just never grown attached to Finnick in the way I think most people who read the books do, and I don't know why that is. I can't explain it. I wish I could. I wish I could join in with you all in loving Finnick, but I just don't. I don't know what it is. I still really love his character and I enjoy him when he's on page. I really appreciate his presence in the book. I love his friendship with Katniss. I just never grew attached to him in any way other than that. For me, he has always been a secondary character in Katniss's story and nothing more than that. I completely understand why people get angry about his death. It is a really hard death and it is like not given a ton of time. I just feel like if we had spent more time on his death, like a few pages or whatever, it just would have been so strange and it would have completely messed up the pacing of that scene. They are in the middle of an action sequence trying to get away from something, and if they spent, you know, minutes over it, then it would have just seemed so horrible. And also, I don't know if I actually would have wanted to read about his death for like pages and pages. I definitely agree, like, maybe more time could have been spent on it. He could have been given a proper farewell. Maybe later on they could have acknowledged it more. But there was so much else going on, like, in that time, you know. Obviously Katniss probably was upset about Finnick dying, but then she saw her sister die. So I do understand why it wasn't given maybe the time that people wanted it to have. I completely understand why people are frustrated with it all the same. I know a lot of people, you know, say Finnick's death was unnecessary, and I personally don't believe it is. I think Suzanne Collins in the narrative needed to kill off a character. It sounds horrible. I feel like she needed to kill off a character to really hit home to us as readers the horrors of war and to losing someone in a war like this, and how, you know, it can be horrible and it can just hit anyone. You know, war doesn't spare anyone just because they've been through something in their life or because they just got married or because they're expecting a child. War doesn't work like that. It can just kill you off if you're in the wrong place at the wrong time, and I think that's what Finnick's death is. And I do think, you know, his death is meant to be tragic, it's meant to be horrible, it's meant to be unjustified, and that is meant to be the effect of it. I guess I just don't get as upset or angry, like I said, because I'm not as attached to him. I'm sorry. And I think partly, you know, I've heard people, you know, get annoyed in general about Finnick's treatment in Mockingjay, and I think that comes down to Katniss's limited perspective, which I think is a huge critique of Mockingjay. Like, when people talk to me about their issues with Mockingjay, half the time it comes back to Katniss's limited perspective. People say, I wanted to see this, I wish we'd see more of this, I wish we'd see more of this, and almost every single time my response is just, but it's in Katniss's POV and we wouldn't see something like that. And that's a valid critique. It's a valid critique to be like, oh, well, the perspective is limited and maybe she should have told it in third person. It's really interesting because the original trilogy was meant to be told in third person, and then she says Katniss's voice just kind of came to her, so she wrote it all in first person. But I think what is good, at least, about it is that she stays true to that perspective, and she stays true to Katniss, who, let's be real, doesn't care that much about other people. She keeps out of people's business, which I respect, but I also see how it's frustrating, because a lot of the time we want to know more about characters and we maybe want to see more exciting and interesting stuff, particularly in Mockingjay when she does spend a lot of time in the hospital and she does spend time knocked out and everything. You know, we miss stuff because she's been knocked out or she's been locked away in a room or whatever. I do think it's realistic, and ultimately for me, this is Katniss's story. This trilogy is her story. It's no one else's. I never felt like this was an ensemble cast. I don't mind that it's limited in her perspective. Obviously, I love her, so I don't mind that. I can definitely imagine if she's not your favourite character, that having it all in her perspective and not getting as much information as maybe you wanted to from Haymitch or Finnick or Peter or Gale or Joanna or whoever, I can imagine that is very frustrating. For me, these books are Katniss's story, and I don't mind if we don't get as much information about some of the side characters. I think we get enough to like feel like they are three-dimensional real people, but I don't know, it's just never bothered me as much, but I love Katniss, so that's probably why. So now we're going to talk about the ending. I want to talk about the ending in kind of two parts because there's two kind of different critiques I see a lot. So the first one is that the ending is very rushed. I would agree with this to an extent. I do think the ending is very rushed, but I think in general these books move forward so quickly. Like, Suzanne Collins really isn't someone to linger. She stuffs a lot into these relatively average sized books. I do think as well the whole feeling of it being rushed and like we didn't get as much information as we possibly wanted to, again, comes from Katniss's limited point of view. You know, at the end of the book, post Prim's death, she is deeply depressed. I mean, she is contemplating dying by suicide, and she is pretty much for a lot of the end of the book either hiding in cupboards in Snow's mansion or locked in her old training centre room while her trial is going on, and she is just completely like in her own head. And obviously that's a limit of her perspective, but for me, I would rather that Suzanne Collins be faithful and be realistic and true to Katniss's trauma than, you know, start talking about her trial and the political machinations, because Katniss wouldn't be paying attention to that. That's not what she cares about. She doesn't even really want to be alive a lot throughout the end of the book, and so she wouldn't be paying attention to, you know, what they're doing in terms of elections and her trial and everything. I think we get the information we need. I will say the whole thing with her trial, the more I read about it this time especially, was so sketchy. Like the fact that it's the first live broadcast and this girl has been exploited already so much, and they just further exploit her pain through live broadcasting her trial for everyone to watch. I completely understand people wanting to know more about the politics and stuff, but ultimately I think the story is Katniss's story and it is about war and trauma, and I think Suzanne Collins wraps that up well enough. There's definitely loose ends, like, don't get me wrong. Am I mad that we don't get any more information about Joanna post the meeting about the Capitol Hunger Games? Yes, I wish we knew more. But I don't know, I guess maybe I've just read so much fan fiction over my time that's post Mockingjay that I've just like osmosis, is that a word? I've just like taken in all of that stuff from fanfiction and just accepted that to be canon. Honestly, the more I read the ending, and I've reread this book like maybe 6 or 7 times, the more I actually would have felt like if she'd added more, the ending would have felt dragged out. I feel like we got enough information. We know where most of the main players and most of the main surviving characters in the series are by the end of the series. The ending is bittersweet, and I think it's meant to be. It's meant to be, you know, we won the war, but there was a huge cost to it. And again, I completely understand if you are someone who likes endings that are wrapped up everything with a neat little bow, or you like things that are slightly more uplifting for your endings. I completely understand why Mockingjay's ending doesn't work for you, but I kind of like bittersweet endings, and I don't mind everything, you know, not being completely wrapped up. I kind of like it that way. I like it when most things are wrapped up, but not everything, so I guess Mockingjay's ending works really well for me because like the main things are wrapped up, but there are still loose ties left. And finally for this video, I'm sorry this has gone on so long, I want to talk about the conclusion to the love triangle. So I know that the love triangle in general is critiqued throughout the trilogy, and a lot of people don't feel like it's necessary, they don't feel like it adds to the story. However, I would argue that the way the love triangle plays out is really interesting in the Hunger Games. Now, there is evidence that Suzanne Collins never really wanted there to be a love triangle in the original trilogy, and it was kind of forced on by her editorial team because it was so popular at the time. Hunger Games was published in 2008, Twilight was all around. I do think it was somewhat pushed on by her editing team, and there is a picture, I'll try and put it up, from an interview that I read recently where her editor, who is David Levithan, by the way, like the David Levithan, he talked about how he basically asked her to make the love triangle fairer, which leads me to my little theory, basically that I do think the Katniss-Peeta relationship was always in the story because it's just so integral to the plot. Their relationship drives the plot along at multiple points throughout the story, whereas I do believe that if you took the romantic elements of Gale and Katniss's relationship out of the story, the narrative itself doesn't change that much. But what I think is really interesting is that Suzanne Collins, you know, took that she had to kind of put a love triangle into this book, and then not only wrote a love triangle, but she wrote a love triangle that is basically not only a choice between like 2 men in her life or whatever, but is a choice between how Katniss decides to approach the war, and the 2 boys represent these 2 different ways of approaching this war. Gale, you know, represents kind of doing whatever it takes, maybe losing part of yourself in the process, and maybe having to sacrifice some human life to get to your ends. Whereas Peeta is definitely someone who still wants the war and, you know, wants there to be change in the society, but he would rather kind of go about it via discussions and via talks. For him, violence is kind of a last resort. And I do think that Suzanne Collins is, you know, side herself is kind of clear in which side she takes. I think that's quite obvious from the conclusion to the love triangle, but I do think that, you know, she allows for there to be empathy and nuance to Gale's side, even if, you know, she herself, the narrative itself, whatever, doesn't agree with it necessarily. Now, I know it's a really popular kind of thought and idea for Katniss to have ended up alone by the end of the trilogy, and I completely understand this. There are multiple points throughout the series where Katniss is kind of like, I would be better off alone anyway, and I've got more important things to think about than kissing. She says a lot of this stuff, and so I get where this interpretation comes from. And we know that Katniss can, you know, survive by herself and be alone and be okay. But for me, Katniss has spent so long shutting people out since she was 11 years old. She has spent so long taking care of other people and taking care of herself and doing things mostly alone. Obviously she did have Gale and her friend and everything, but she's not relied on someone emotionally until she meets Peter. And I think it's really significant that when they're in the cave in the first games, there's a line Peter says which is, let me take care of you for a while, and she says that his arms are the first arms that she has felt safe in since her father died. And I do think that Peter is the first person that kind of takes care of Katniss emotionally since her father died. And don't get me wrong, I think Gale was definitely a good friend to her and was there for her and everything, but there is a difference, I feel. I just don't feel like he emotionally supported her the way Peter does, and particularly the way Peter does after the first Hunger Games, you know, with her nightmares and everything. And for me, there was just nothing wrong with a character, particularly one who has spent so many years taking care of other people, needing to rely on someone else for a little bit. You know, it's not weak, it's just being human, and there's nothing wrong with having a person that you open up to and that you rely on for emotional support. Being the person who just takes everything and doesn't have a release anywhere, it's toxic, it's not good, and we see that built up with Katniss when she doesn't have anyone to turn to in Mockingjay. You see her being mentally disorientated and feeling really distressed when she doesn't have the person in her life who she has, you know, come to turn to for emotional support. I just don't really understand why Katniss, of all the YA protagonists ever, has become this kind of poster child that she should have ended up alone and she can rise above, you know, ending up with someone. I know most YA series, maybe not so much nowadays because I know YA is changing, but I think a lot of YA series do end up with the main character with their love interest, and I don't really understand why Katniss has to be different. She can still be inspirational and incredible and strong and also settle down with a love interest. The two aren't mutually exclusive. Especially for me, you know, like I said, at the end of Mockingjay, she is considering suicide, she is deeply depressed and deeply traumatized and really suffering. And although when she gets back to District 12, Greasy Say takes care of her in terms of feeding her, no one is offering her the emotional support that she needs. And the first thing that Peter does when he gets back is he plants primroses for her. I just think there's nothing wrong when you are suffering mentally, and suffering as much as she is at the end of Mockingjay, with needing to rely on someone for that emotional support. And if that person happens to be someone who you also like are in a relationship with, that is okay. Peter has been established to be someone who gives her hope, but also someone who is kind and reminds her of the kindness in the world, like he does with the primroses. And, you know, this has been going back to when he gave her the bread at the beginning of the first book when they were 11. I just think he really does fit her, and I know some people think that them being together means like the Capitol one, but I honestly don't think the Capitol ever cared about them being together. It was just a means to an end, and actually the idea for them being in a fake relationship was Peter and Haymitch's idea, and Katniss went along with it. And I don't know, I just don't buy into that argument. I don't think, you know, Peter and Katniss is like the Capitol's design and Gale and Katniss is like the Rebellion's design or anything like that. And I do personally feel like she loves him. I know it's not done in the traditional way it is in YA. She isn't ogling at his arm. She doesn't say like outright I love you to him. But I mean, she does say when she's talking about Haymitch and Mockingjay because he loves Peter too. And she talks about like having a physical pain in her chest when she thinks about Peter being hurt. When she's about to be reunited with him in 13 before he does the thing, she's thinking about kissing him and like is excited by that prospect. I know it's not presented in the way we traditionally are used to in YA, but I still think it's valid, and I think she does love him. I just don't think Suzanne Collins, you know, dedicated like whole scenes to them declaring their love for each other, which I honestly prefer because that's not what the story is about. I know a lot of people interpret Katniss as asexual, and I've never actually addressed this. I personally interpret her as a demisexual. I still think she experiences some romantic attraction as well. I think that's possibly demi as well. You can interpret her how you want, and if that interpretation with her being ace and aromantic, you know, leads to her not being with someone, it's totally valid. But I have always interpreted her as like demisexual, demi-romantic. I definitely think she grows romantically interested in Peter. She definitely experiences desire when she is kissing him multiple times throughout the series. That's like my personal hot take on that. And finally, the kids thing. So Katniss mentions multiple times throughout the series how she doesn't want kids. I think it's really important to remember the context she is saying this in. She's saying this in the context of a world that takes children in a reaping and forces them to fight to the death, in a world where she sees children starving to death every single day, particularly because her mother is a healer. And I think it's important to remember like the context of the world that she lives in the epilogue is so different. We obviously don't know much about it, but we get the impression that it is safe and that, you know, the Hunger Games don't exist anymore. There is enough food to go around and to keep the children healthy. And, you know, it is literally the meadow that she dreams about after she makes out with Peter on the beach and catching fire. She has a dream about a place where Peter's child would be safe. That is literally manifested in the epilogue. And like, I do think it makes sense for her character. She is a very maternal character. She takes care of Prim, she takes care of Rue, she takes care of Iris. And I don't know, you know, it's 20 years after she has said all that stuff in the epilogue, and I don't know about you, but I've changed a lot. Like when I was 17, I also was on the board of, I don't ever want to have kids, I don't want kids, no no no, and now I'm 24, which is only 7 years later, and I'm like, maybe, like I've definitely shifted on that argument, and I do think it's very possible for her to 15 years down the line, you know, after seeing that the world is okay and the world is safe, to think maybe kids would be okay. And for all the people who think Peter forced her to have children, first of all, Peter has never forced anything romantic in their relationship. Katniss is always the one who instigates anything legitimate in their romantic relationship. And secondly, Katniss's literal flaw on the block when she is training to go into the war in Mockingjay is that she won't take orders from people. So like, I just don't think that argument really holds up. I know it's tropey, I totally understand why people don't like the whole married kids thing as an end of series. I know that's like a general opinion people have and therefore they don't like it in the series, but I hope I've been able to explain why I think it fits with her character and why I think it's fitting for the story. It is a bittersweet ending, and I think that is no better summed up than the image of her children happily playing on a meadow that they don't know is a mass grave. Like, I think that's such a powerful image and just really sums up the ending. And that's pretty much everything. This was an essay once again. I'm so sorry, I cannot shut up when I talk about this trilogy, but I had a lot of feelings. I know I haven't been able to cover everything in this video because it could have been like 2 hours long, but I hope I've covered enough and I've given you a sense of why I do really like this book. The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes is coming out in just a few days. I have a lot planned for next week. I'm doing a live reading on Jess from Read by Jess's channel. That is happening at 5 PM BST on Wednesday the 20th of May, so I will leave a link to the live show in the description down below if you would like to come join us. We are not going to be talking about spoilers for the new book, but we will have general Hunger Games chat, so please join us for that if you would like. And I will also be putting up a vlog of my reactions to the new book and also probably a discussion video talking more in depth about my thoughts on the book as well. And that is everything for this video. I hope you're all safe, I hope you're all well, and I will see you soon in my next video. Bye!